Holla ballers, what's going on? It's Preacher. Let's continue our healing series. Now we're moving into the world of the Mythic Plus, where we're going to get to do all kinds of good stuff. So, by this point in our little journey, there are several things you should now be doing. You should be very comfortable with your spells. By that, I mean you should know the right answer to each and every situation. You've had lots of practice in random heroics by this point. Maybe you've even done some mythics, but you're generally understanding that at 3 people are low, the tank is really low, how you're prioritizing who and which spell to cast in order to save their lives in the most efficient way possible without just running dry or resorting to sort of like spam healing in horrible scenarios. By now then, with all this experience we've had doing some healing, we should be very, very happy in knowing where the threats and the dangers are of each and every dungeon in the game. Pretty much, you should know where tanks are going to take obscene amounts of damage, where the group is going to take damage, where you're going to have to dispel, where you know these things are going to happen. Miles before you even get there, you know that at this point, this is probably going to happen. I'm going to have to dispel here. Perhaps I'm going to be able to do that. On the back of that, we should also now be fully aware of where our class utility comes into play and which specific locations it's best to use it. A good player uses all the tools at his disposal. So depending on which class of healer you are playing, if you have an AoE stun, if you have a great deal of burst damage, if you have something that snares, if you have something that slows, if you have something that speeds the group up, all these kind of things, you should have a roadmap in your mind of where it's best to use those things. Where can I drop a Windrush here? Where am I going to use my Ursol's Vortex? Where am I going to do all these little bits and bobs? Where do I want to be aware of gripping people, etc.? You should already have that road mapped out for each layout of the dungeon. And finally, what we should have learned by now, which was the big thing from the previous video, which is moving our gaze, our vision, back to the action in between heals. So that's the idea that once you commit to casting a heal, whichever class you have, you can now put your vision back onto the field, and that allows us to not take stupid damage and to be fully aware of things that are happening visually, where players are going. It's all good saying I know when I want to grip, but you might have to suddenly change that because you've seen a player go wandering off. Not something you're going to see if you're just looking at raid frames. So, bearing all that in mind, we're going to turn up the volume on the difficulty, and that is going to be into Mythic Plus. Now, as I said in the Pug video, and in the previous healing video, pugging is just a fucking nightmare for a healer. It's really bad. It's the worst experience you can have in World of Warcraft right now. However, it's something that you might have to do if you've not picked up friends, but trust me, being a good healer makes you a lot of fucking friends, surprisingly. If you do well at this, people are like, I want to play with that healer, especially if they recognize that things go really well when you're in the group. So we're going to be dealing with affixes and stuff like that. So your first step into Mythic Plus might be something like Mythic Plus 2 or whatever it might be, your first key that you pick up if you're making your own group. We had some funny things such as people asking for 885 geared healers to run them through Darkheart Thicket Plus 2. LOL. Go and die. But generally speaking, making your own group as a healer doesn't take long to fill up, etc. So you should jump into your Mythic Pluses. So what are we going to learn in Mythic Plus? Mythic Plus, by its very nature, is a speed run. You're going to be going fast. Why? The faster you go, the more chests you get. This is an incentive, particularly for... it's going to get worse for you if it's a weaker skilled tank, to go as fast as possible, which means pulling all the things in the universe, particularly before you get affixes. So what this means is we have to look after our mana because honestly, most tanks aren't going to be paying attention to your mana. We've made a big deal of it in our tanking series that you should always be aware of your healer's mana, so you don't do something stupid like pull when he's right? But not every tank does that, as you well know. Looking after your mana is now part of your job. It's part of your job. And that doesn't mean that you sit and get full drinks. Absolutely not. Where you're going to do this, as you'll see in the background, is finding positions that are safe but further ahead than where the rest of the group is. And you're waiting for any moment you can to get out of combat and be close enough to still be useful for after the drink. You're not thinking about when can I start the drink, you're thinking about where you're going to be after the drink. And what it's going to be is this combination of sips, really. Of sips. And once you get this done properly, particularly try and get some mana, some food from a mage, but honestly, the stacks of water that you can get from the inn are just fine, and they're not too expensive, like 2 gold for quite a few. Don't be shy with it, right? Don't be a Scrooge with your fucking mana, because you don't want to do that, because things can get out of control really quickly. It only takes 1 ninja pull to be where you're going to be spamming your fucking ass off. The last thing you want to do is being like really stingy and like, I've got 20% mana, I can get away with it for now. You want to be doing constant tiny little sips, and being a good healer, finding places where you can do this that does not stop the rest of the group progressing. There's this weird idea that I run into with a lot of newer healers. It's like, dude, I haven't got any mana, but they're just stood there. They had the time to type the fucking shit out, but they didn't start drinking. And it blows my fucking mind when I see this all the time, is guys who have the time to stand and type while they're out of combat, and just, they're kind of like stood in this almost petulant way of waiting for the rest of the group to stop while they refresh their mana. Not going to get much love for that, particularly in the Mythic Plus. Thankfully, because of Mythic Plus and people's experience in there, it's not something we see most often anymore, but it is still a part of the gaming world. All you're doing is you're looking for these little positions. Similar to how tanks look for these pockets to create the death balls, you're going to be looking for these positions where you know you can get out of combat for maybe a second or so before the tank gets to the next pack, and in that you're going to initiate drinking. For the most part, that means you can continue to drink while the tank sorts out the mobs, get them gathered up, DPS is going to be doing their job, and then you can stand up and then continue your process after getting off several seconds of healing, which for the most part, it's going to give you like half a mana bar. You can pull that off pretty readily. Even if it's only a quarter of your mana bar that you're refreshing, that's more than enough to carry you through the next pack to get the next sip of water in, and so on and so forth. Looking for these places. You could combine this by throwing down things like stuns. As long as you get this done before you get into combat, you can in fact just keep spamming drinks all the way through. Don't be afraid of this. Absolutely do not be afraid of this. It's a good skill to pick up, because you'll just find, you'll just realize that you never run out of mana anymore in this kind of content. It doesn't matter how hard it gets, is your mana is always pretty good. If people die, it's not because you ran out of mana or had any of these issues, even while undergeared. It's one of the most important skills for healers to pick up, is you're going to be, think of it this way, by controlling your mana and taking these little sips every now and again, what you're actually doing is increasing the overall pace and DPS of the dungeon. You're keeping people interested. When people start to fail in WoW, it's often because they become bored, distracted, and disinterested. If you're keeping the flow of the dungeon going by not making people wait for you, then you're going to keep them interested, and you're generally going to have an overall smoother time. These things all work synergetically to form a really nice group. Okay. Now, Mythic Plus. Further to this is going to be the introduction of the affixes. And this is the thing that you shouldn't be afraid of, but it's something you should welcome with open arms, because this is what's going to keep your interest in the game relatively high as you continue to do dungeons that you've actually been doing since the very start of Legion. That's what the affixes are there to do. They're there to make things more interesting. So the affixes we had in the EU while recording this were bolstering and skittish. The tank we had was 853. I was about 846, 843 at the time. And we took this group all the way to a +7. With bolstering and skittish. And even our tank was like, I'm not confident in doing this. You know, I've got a weaker healer than would ordinarily exist in this environment. I'm a weaker tank than would ordinarily exist in this environment. And this is where we say that's not the purpose. If we work together as a team, this is fine. Like we taught in the tanking videos, is at this level, you start working, you're not a solo fucking hero. And you work together as a team. So, with bolstering in mind, what does that do to our healing plan? When someone says to us, I know the threats and dangers of this dungeon, but then we throw in something like bolstering, how does that change our game plan? That's the thought process to go in. If it was overflowing, how does that change our game plan? If it was sanguine, how does that change our game plan? And some people say it doesn't change it at all, but in fact it does. You might not realize that you've altered it if you've had some experience, but it does alter your game plan. You're thinking a little bit differently. There's more things to manage there. Like necrotic. How does necrotic alter our game plan? So with bolstering, what does it do? What did I deal with this week? Well, I know certain things. I know that traditionally there might be packs, and this is the big change that happens with bolstering, that usually just blow the fuck up. And they might be big packs, particularly things like Imps in Court of Stars, or all the Whelps that you'll get in Darkheart Thicket. These kind of big AoE mobs now change. Previously, every time you've done this dungeon, they've just been extra fodder for while people did AoE damage and went, lol, look at my millions of damage. Now, this is a healer situation to deal with, because as these things die and they bolster the other targets, you're likely to end up in a scenario where previously you didn't have to heal at all and maybe you did some damage, where now you're going to have to spam heal. Because this one remaining dragon or whelp, if the DPS did a bad job of balancing their damage out, is now going to crush the tank really badly. It's going to crush the tank pretty goddamn heavily, and you're going to have to be able to deal with this. So what we do is we alter our game plan to be aware of this. Once we start a big pull, we think, it doesn't matter how wussy or insignificant this pack was in the past, this could become a real big problem right now, and I need to be aware of it. This also comes back down to paying attention to your environment, because now I'm watching. Are they DPSing them down properly? Are they not? Is somebody going to be really heavily bolstered here? I need to be ready for that. Perhaps the tank's going to kite. Do I have a movement speed increase for him? Do you see the questions and the way this has changed and developed? It's quite a different scenario to what you've been dealing with before. It's very different, and this is why it becomes interesting. This is why it's fun to deal with this stuff. Similarly, as we moved up to +7, again with an 853 tank and me not picking... I think I picked up a couple of items, probably about 846 at this point. We moved up to Mythic +7. Okay, so we're in Mythic +7, which then introduces Skittish in this case. So Skittish in this case changes our game plan again. Skittish is going to make it so that, realistically speaking, we're going to have to start healing the DPS very fucking quickly. If we combine things like bolstering and a really overly DPSing rogue or a mage or something like that, there's a very high chance that I'm going to have to respond to something extremely quickly. And that's not something I had to deal with before I dealt with this affix. People are going to start losing aggro. Simultaneously, things are going to bolster up to do a lot of damage to the tank. Imagine what that does to the HPS. So we change our game plan again. We now change it to be using very fast, very usually inefficient heals, but always ready to fire them out. All these things start working together. This is why the affixes are very, very cool, and how as a healer we can not only be dealing with it, but prepared to deal with it before it becomes a problem. And what do we always do? What do we always do? The number one piece of advice I give to anybody, particularly if they're going into the pug environment or a new piece of content or whatever it might be, the biggest piece of advice is we prepare for the worst. We prepare for the absolute worst, and if it's better than that, then we're in good shape. We're in good shape. We're actually not too bad here. Oh, wow. I was expecting... What's the classic thing after you know you going into a bad scenario? And in fact, our tank said it. It's like, I was expecting to die here. And then afterwards, you went, you know what? I was expecting that to be way worse. Yeah. If you prepare for something to be horrible, like I'm going to have to work my balls here with cooldowns, I'm going to have to struggle my ass off, then what you find is once you actually do well, because you were prepared for these things to happen, then things actually go much better than you expected. And then you have a more fun run, and you feel a nice self-satisfaction and reward. Now, that nearly enough brings us to the end of our healing series. I've given you all the tools you need to deal with pretty much anything in the game. We're going to look at raiding a little bit, but mainly we're going to look at how healing changes when you're in a raid environment, as opposed to when you're using your entire toolkit in dungeons. Like for me personally, on a personal note, the Mythic Plus dungeon system, particularly with friends or with reasonable players, is absolutely the most fun you can have, like on your healer, because one, it's usually down to you to deal with it, and you have to use your whole toolkit to get through there and to get things done properly and to get things done in a satisfying way. In raids, it changes a little bit, but it's all about dealing with being, again, part of a symbiotic relationship with the rest of the healers to deal with that. So we'll talk about that then. All right, guys? So please get yourselves into Mythic Plus. I've shown you here that you can do it. It's not about item level requirements or any of that nonsense. You can see it right here and have some fun in there. Let me see your results as well. What item level did you kick off with your new healer and where did you get to? I'd love to see. All right, guys. Thank you so much. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.